Okay, so Dr. Brad Schoenfeld is a professor of exercise science at Lehman College in the Bronx, New York, where he serves as a graduate director of the Human Performance and Fitness Program. Dr. Schoenfeld has published more than 250 peer-reviewed scientific papers. I'm pretty sure it's more than that now, on various exercise and sports nutrition-related topics, and authored the textbook Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy, which is highly regarded as the most up-to-date textbook on how to gain muscle. For people like me, Brad is viewed as a leading authority in all things hypertrophy. So when Brad talks, you listen. I've simply invited Brad here today to pick his brain and help bring a little bit of clarity to clients on what needs to be done to maximize muscle mass potential. I will caveat this by saying there is no set formula for building muscle, and it varies greatly per individual. But thanks to Brad and his extensive research, there is now enough information to draw up a general guideline that will have positive outcomes for most people. At the very least, it will provide people with a foundation on which to build. So Brad, I did mention that I was going to hit you with a case study. So I think this is the best way to communicate to clients and give them an idea of what's required. So we're going to take the example of a male in his 30s who's working a sedentary job, 40 hours per week, has a young family at home, and realistically can commit to 3 hours of meaningful exercise per week. So maybe start off with realistic target setting. So what is a realistic target to aim for over the course of 6 months to a year for someone like this?
Can you clarify what you mean when you say a realistic target as far as how much muscle can they gain?
Sorry, in terms of in terms of muscle gain, yeah.
And this is an untrained individual, someone who has not lifted weights before.
No, this would be somebody who has been in the gym consistently, for a number of years. But just, let's say they get distracted by what's said via social media, and they're trying different diets. They might decide to take on a marathon, and all of these things basically affect their plan to gain weight. So if this person was to focus solely on hypertrophy, what would be a realistic target to hit?
So I'll give the caveat that it would somewhat depend upon, or would a lot depend upon, how serious the person was about lifting before that, and how close they are to their genetic ceiling, because the closer you get to your genetic potential, the less gain, the more diminished your gains are going to be over time. With that said, on a general level, let's say someone who's reasonably well trained, who's been, like you said, training, but hasn't really been putting in a lot of effort in that regard. I think a good on a average type of end might be around 3 kilograms in a year, 3 to 4 kilograms,
Okay.
1.5 to 2 kilograms in 6 months, if you want to go that route. But it could be more. So again, that could be somewhat more, somewhat less, depending on that, on genetics, on lifestyle factors, on how well trained they are.
Okay. And then looking to hit those targets, how do we help them? Starting off by, let's say, training frequency. So I've already said that you can commit to training 3 times per week. What are we looking to do within those 3 sessions if we're to maximize time in the gym? I know typically, let's say when I was going to college, you were given specific rep ranges for hypertrophy. I know your research has then shifted the thinking on that. So be 6 to 8 reps for strength, would be 8 to 10 reps for hypertrophy, or anything over 12 is seen as muscle endurance. So what would we be looking to prescribe in order to make use of the time in the gym?
Yeah, sure. And I'd also start out to say that if you're going to limit yourself to 3, you can make very nice gains on a 3-day a week, let's say 1 hour, 3 days a week. But if you're looking to maximize your genetic potential, generally you're going to need to do somewhat more over time, at least in cycling your training. But going with what you're saying, I think you can get the majority of your gains certainly in that type of program. And as far as rep ranges, there is no hypertrophy zone. So the whole concept of a repetition range for muscle hypertrophy has been largely debunked. And I would say that research is somewhat equivocal on many topics, or at least my level of confidence in terms of the strength of confidence that I have in providing a recommendation will be somewhat muted. This is something I have very strong confidence in, and that upwards of 30 plus repetitions. So anywhere between, let's say, 5 to 30 reps on a volume equated basis is just not going to make much difference, at least in whole muscle hypertrophy. So you have a very wide range of a spectrum of ranges that you can train in. Now, with that said, I do think there is the potential, and this is where my confidence is going to be less strong, where I think the evidence is weak or weaker. But I don't discount the possibility that combining rep ranges may be of value. So again, when I give these types of recommendations, it's always going to be based on the strength of evidence. I can give very strong, a strong recommendation that you can train throughout a wide spectrum of loading ranges. And if you just train with one or the other, achieve very similar whole muscle hypertrophy. On a weaker level, I could say that there may be an additive value of combining some heavier work with some lighter work. And there's several factors that might influence that. Number one is fiber type specific differences. So there may be type 1 versus type 2 hypertrophy differences between higher and lower rep ranges, although again, the evidence is quite equivocal. There also may be, there is some evidence that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy may be involved to a greater extent when you're working with lighter loads. So
just getting back to the type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, just to explain to people. So the type 2 muscle fibers will be regarded as, let's say, your more fast twitch fibers. So they will be engaged more in heavier lifts to kind of closer to maximum force rather than hitting 12, 15 higher reps.
Conceivably. So again, it's pretty clear in the literature that you get high threshold motor unit recruitment, which is you do recruit the fast twitch fibers largely if you train with light loads, as long as you're going close to failure.
Okay, yeah. So as long as you're hitting that stage in your set where it's getting tough, the weight's getting tough to move.
Correct. I mean, with your repetition RIR, your repetitions in reserve is within 1 or 2 reps, if not to failure. But there is also some evidence, again, that it's equivocal, that light loads, because the slow twitch fibers are endurance-oriented fibers, and at least theoretically, we can make the case that keeping those fibers under tension for longer periods of time would help to greater inroad stimulate those fibers to a greater degree, and thus you might be able to target those fibers. Whereas there is some evidence that you don't get full stimulation of the type 2 fibers with, even though you get a lot of recruitment. Certainly recruitment is going to be quite similar, but the total stimulation of the type 2 fibers might be somewhat suboptimal with lighter loads. So, but again, I just want to emphasize that is theoretical at this point, and the evidence is equivocal on that.
Okay. And then just sticking to the rep ranges. So when you're asking a client to, pick a weight that you can do for 6 to 8 reps, or 8 to 10 or 10 to 12, you're not talking you do 10 reps and then put the weight down. It should be, you mentioned RIR, so reps in reserve. You should be working to a high degree of effort within that rep range. So a lot of the time people make the mistake of, picking a weight that they can, and lifting for 12 reps, and they could conceivably lift for 18 or 20 reps. While they're training in a rep range, they're not going to get the maximum benefit, or they're not going to be training towards that outcome of maximizing muscle mass because they're not lifting hard enough or lifting heavy enough,
correct,
or challenging themselves enough.
That goes with any rep range. That there is so the evidence that you need to train to failure is weak. Certainly,
Yeah,
strength actually, it not only isn't there evidence that it's beneficial, there's some evidence that might be detrimental to train to failure, at least a lot. With hypertrophy, the evidence again is somewhat more equivocal, but I think, in my opinion, based on the evidence that we have and from what I'm aware of as far as upcoming research, including research that I'm collaborating on, you do not need to train to failure. You need to be, when I say you need to be, I think the evidence shows that being within a rep or two of failure would be sufficient, rather than having to go to failure. Although I don't discount that selectively training to failure might be beneficial if you're, especially as you get closer to your genetic ceiling. Now, when we talk about these things, Kieran, it depends upon what your goals. If your goals are bodybuilding, I think this may matter. Like when I say, I don't think it matters
yeah,
at all for the guy that you're talking about in your case study. I don't think that's going to make a meaningful, when we talk about what is practically meaningful. I don't think it's going to be practically meaningful for that person. So if that person is within 1 or 2 reps short of their of RIR, at least on some of the sets, and maybe some of the other
yeah,
sets, they could be even 3 or 4 away, but certainly on at least 1 or 2, a couple of the sets, majority, if you will, would be within a couple reps short of failure. I think that is sufficient where it's not going to make an appreciable difference. And just to go back to the repetition range, I also do think from a practical standpoint, the even though, as I just said, that the hypertrophy range is not valid from what we know through research, like that there's something magical about it. I do think that it's a good default repetition range. It's more efficient. If you train with lighter loads, it's going to prolong the time that you're in the gym, which is going to be detrimental to what you're
yeah,
talking about. So I think that in general, uh, 6 to 12, 8 to 12 is a good default rep range. Now, if you have an injury you're training around, you might need to, or you're older, you have osteoarthritis, now 30 years old, I wouldn't expect that. But
yeah.
so again, this is where the
I hope
nuances
not.
come in, and it's always specific to the individual.
Yeah, yeah. And then just, I suppose, moving on to the next, one of the next points, it ties in well with what you're saying there about not necessarily having to train to failure. Um, Load versus volume. So picking that heavy weight or opting to do more repetitions of a given exercise at that same weight. I think I was listening to a podcast here on recently, and you were talking about research that you had carried out, and it showed that training with a high volume of the same weight elicited the same hypertrophy, or if not a similar result to increasing the load over time. Um, so how would you look to manipulate those things, or would you look to let's say cycle between the two as the program progressed?
Define volume. Are you talking about volume load, which is the total work that you're doing? Or you're talking about number of sets per exercise?
And the number, I think that study in question was you increase the reps at that given weight. So it'd be in that.
Okay, correct. Okay, yeah. So you're talking about our loads versus reps study. And yeah, so that's the overload concept. So the concept of overload has always been, but certainly the way most people think about it is that if you want to increase muscle mass, you need to progressively increase the amount of weight that you're using. So let's say you start out and you get your 10 RM and you're training within a rep or two short of failure at that 10 RM. Obviously, as you get stronger, you could do more than, let's say that's 200, or I know you're in kilos. Let's say it's 100 kilograms on your squat or bench or whatever it is. So let's say you're squatting 100 kilograms for 10 reps. And you could have you're in 1 or 2 RIR. Over time, if you keep doing that, conceivably, you should be able to use a heavier load. The question is, so is progressive overload necessarily specific to having to increase the load? Our study showed it isn't. If you just do more reps, let's say you could have done 2 more reps rather than increasing the load, you do 12 reps at that same load. You do 13. And we actually carried out a controlled study. We went to failure on each set, where instead of increasing the load, well, we had one group where they increased the load. The other group, instead of increasing the load, just did more repetitions at whatever weight they started with. and the hypertrophy was very similar, actually slightly better on one of the muscles that we looked at, the rectus femoris. Not clear why.
Okay.
That might have been a chance finding, but certainly there was no
Mhm.
evidence. I think it's really a non-inferiority, that there's no evidence that it was suboptimal to increase the repetitions. And I will say that was over an 8-week period. Now, if you are you going to
Okay.
do that over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years? We don't.
You'll end up with a
I
stupid amount of reps.
Yeah, I would say at some point it probably you probably do want to start increasing the load. It's not, but the point is, it's not an either or choice. It's not
Mhm.
like you need to either increase load or increase reps, and there's other ways to progressively overload. You can increase sets, you can increase you can increase the density of training, perform more work in less time. So there's certainly other forms of progressive overload. But the classic, because I think the term load is in overload, people necessarily think if I overload,
More weight.
I have to put more weight
Mhm.
on. And like I said, that is not necessarily the case.
And I suppose sticking to you mentioned it there. Sorry, it was the study that referenced increasing the reps. It was manipulating or changing the stimulus by adding reps instead of kilograms to the bar. You mentioned it there. Sorry, about managing volume in your workouts and how to maybe utilize that for somebody again who's limited to 3 times a week in the gym.
Yeah. So if you're limited to 3 days a week, and I'm assuming an hour type of session, right? Or what's how?
Mhm.
Yeah. So your volume, you're going to have to limit your volume. Now, volume has been shown over and over to be a driver of hypertrophy, despite, in my humble opinion, what some claim. That there is a relationship, and it's consistent in the literature. Now, it's again depends upon what your goals are, and I would say that even for someone who just does the everyday lifter, you can see that certainly there can be practically meaningful benefits to doing somewhat more volume, but it starts to level off. Um, Generally speaking, the literature seems to show somewhere between 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week, but you're not going to be able to get that in 3 sessions in general. So I would say that the good news is you can get a majority of those gains with less, with 5, 6, 7 sets
Mhm.
per muscle. Let's say you're training total body 3 days a week and you're doing, 3 sets. You can get close to that. 3 sets per exercise, three
Mhm.
days a week. That's 9 sets. You're getting very close to what would be a kind of
Yeah,
floor. So
that
anyway,
was the next thing
cool.
yeah, sorry, that's the next point I was going to make. I think the mistake people make is when they have limited time in the gym that they go for these body splits. So they might do an upper body day, lower body day, arm day, but they're not hitting that minimum threshold as you say in terms of uh, hitting the same muscle X amount of sets in a given week. When you limit yourself to only training legs on a Monday, upper body on a Wednesday, it would make more sense to do a total body on a Friday if that was the case. But a lot of people might just take the opportunity to do arms, but you've missed out on your opportunity to, make volume work in your favor. So if you are limited for time in the gym, you can only make 3 sessions per week. You'd be looking at splitting it into 3 total body workouts. Um, and then another point to make a mention is if you're doing 3 total body workouts, what would be the optimal recovery time between session? Because you wouldn't, well, I'd imagine doing total body one on a Monday and then total body two on a Tuesday. You're interfering with recovery, which may impede progress.
Yeah, so a couple things there. The main benefit of a split routine is, in my opinion, is to manage your volume when you're doing higher volumes, because then you can, let's say, do your legs on Monday and then your chest on Tuesday. So you can actually train managing recovery better. If you're just going to do lesser volume, there's no need to manage your recovery in that fashion, because or to manage your volume, because you're going to be able to recover. Generally speaking, the good rule of thumb is 48 hours rest in between sets. Now, look, could you do, let's say you have 3 days a week, it's an option to do, let's say you want to do weekend, let's say you have weekends free, you want to do Saturday, Sunday, and then one day during the week. You could do an upper lower, let's say Saturday do upper body, Sunday do lower body, and then do a total body on Wednesday. So it's not like you have to commit to just splitting or just so there's other ways to do it. And again, this is where I can give general recommendations, but it's always going to be specific to the lifestyle needs of the individual.
Okay. And then within those workouts, we can get down to exercise selection. You've, again, 3 hours in the gym per week. You want to be, I would imagine, doing as many multi-joint exercises as possible, and not just focusing on, let's say, bicep curls for too much of your week. You want to be getting in pressing movements, rowing movements, hip hinge movements. So what is that simply because there's more muscles involved in those lifts, and that's what encourages greater growth?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that for, let's say, biceps and triceps, you probably can only, conceivably, you don't even need to train them. I somewhat hesitate to say this because I do think that it's beneficial if you want to maximize muscle mass, certainly you do. But again, depending on your time limits, your biceps get a lot of work in your pulling exercises, your lat pull downs, your rows. Your triceps get a lot of work in your pressing movements. So it depends upon what you're doing there. But I certainly think it would be appropriate to, let's say, you could do one set per bot for your biceps instead of doing three. So, and your triceps, let's say your arms can do less, or you can just do them once a week. So I think there's more flexibility there depending upon how you're structuring your routine. And yeah, your multi-joint movements work not only supporting you getting multiple muscles, major muscles involved, but you're also getting more of your stabilizer muscles, particularly if you're doing free weight type exercises. So like your adductors, if you're doing, let's say you're doing leg extensions, it's primarily targeting your quadriceps. If you're doing a squat or a leg press, your adductors, adductors, your abductors, your adductors. Anyway, multiple other muscles will get involved to a greater extent. Thus, you're able to work more of your body. And I also would say to that effect, so you should, when it comes to exercise selection, look to vary the movements to some degree. That don't, if you're just doing like a flat press every time, it's working a certain portion of the chest, but muscles have varied attachments and varied planes. So you do want to look to applied anatomy.
Different angles, different, let's say, implements.
And I would also say, but this is important too. You also have to look at the muscle group, because a muscle group or a muscle like the lateral deltoids does not get a lot of work from your multi-joint exercise. So there are certain muscles that will be deficient. So I would say you would need to do some type of lateral raise or focused work for certain muscles. Your biceps and triceps less so because of their involvement. But people think that like the overhead press, you're going to get equal work on all your deltoids. It's primarily a frontal and anterior deltoid exercise. So you got to look at what muscles are not worked as much through the multi-joint movements.
Multi-joint and target down for the single joint then.
Correct.
Just on the multi-joint exercises, something you would have, I'm not sure if it was drilled into you, but it was the build-up of substrates in the bigger exercises, and the hormonal impact that has, that helps encourage the development of muscles. Is there any stock in that, or is it just down to the mechanical tension that's applied and the effort that's given to an exercise?
Well, when it comes to the hormonal aspect, the evidence does not seem to show that the post-exercise hormonal spikes. When we're talking about hormones, we're doing certain types of movements, generally large multi-joint movements with shorter rest periods on higher volumes, does produce a greater post-exercise spike in growth hormone IGF-1 and testosterone. And that lasts for an hour or so, hour or two after exercise. So within a couple hours, it is back to normal levels. The overriding evidence that we see now suggests that that is not a primary driver. Can I completely rule out there may not be some involvement? No, but certainly I would not program around that. I don't think that that's certainly a major driver. When it comes to other mechanisms, I mean, we know mechanical tension is the primary driver of hypertrophy, and that has to do with the body converting mechanical signals into chemical signals, which drives the hypertrophic response. But are other mechanisms involved? And some people have very strong opinions one way or the other. And in my
Get yourself in trouble.
In my humble opinion, there is insufficient evidence to have a strong opinion. We can't have a strong opinion. If there's not strong evidence, you can't have a strong opinion. And I certainly cannot rule out. I think there's controversial evidence or conflicting evidence on both sides, that there's some evidence showing, let's say, metabolites may be involved, and there's other evidence suggesting that they wouldn't. I will also say there are hundreds of metabolites that are produced during exercise. So we've only scratched the surface in trying to look into their effects on stimulation. But what I would say with a fairly good degree of confidence is that if they are involved, that they would be certainly they're secondary to the mechanical tension.
Okay. Just while you were talking there, you mentioned rest periods. So again, taking our individual into account and the 3 hours training per week, you would be looking to minimize rest periods. But how do you do that in such a way that doesn't impact on your potential for growth? Because take, for example, if you have a short rest period before you go back in to the exercise, you're not going to be able to lift that load for the same amount of reps because you're too tired. So utilizing something like a superset or setting your rest at a specific time, what would your approach be?
Yeah, so good question. And there is evidence. Our lab has carried out a longitudinal study in this regard, and others have as well, that suggests that 2 minutes is probably kind of, for certainly on your multi-joint exercises, 2 minutes is kind of I don't want to say a threshold, because it's not like 1 minute and 58 seconds versus 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But I mean, somewhere in that, when you start getting below 2 minutes, you're going to start to compromise to a greater extent your volume load, which can impede hypertrophy. So I think that's kind of a good rule of thumb, a heuristic to take into account, to use a 2 minute rest. But are there other ways around it? Can you do, like you said, supersetting? Potentially. We actually have a study that's going to start in February. So there really has not been good research on this. I was involved in to my knowledge, the only study that has looked at it longitudinally in a controlled fashion. And it was not, so we looked at biceps, triceps, superset versus doing them separately, but it was using resistance bands with untrained subjects.
Okay.
Not sure what we could take out. We're going to actually have trained subjects in this study and have a more ecologically valid, I think, approach to it. So I think at this point, I would say that it is if your time is pressed, it is a good compromise. That I don't think it's going to, when I say I don't think, it's, again, I would say my confidence is still somewhat weak in this, but I do think that, if you're asking me now, that it will not compromise hypertrophy and that you can make better use of your time. Now, I also do think that it depends on the movement. So if you're doing multi-joint exercises, they take a lot out of you systemically. So let's say you're doing a shoulder press into a row. So I think that or a bench press into a row. There are large multi-joint exercises that you're fatigued just systemically after you do them.
Yeah.
So I do think there'll be some compromising on the alternative movement. But
because if you're going to do a squat paired with a chin up, you're not going to have much energy left.
Correct.
Yeah. And then just before we get into maybe the dietary interventions, say the impact of other exercise on the potential for growing muscle mass. So a lot of the times, I don't know what it is, but maybe it's a midlife crisis thing where lads just get this thing into their head about doing a marathon, and they start jogging, but at the same time they're expecting to see muscle mass gains in the gym. Um, I just the two of them just can't go together. What is it that impedes the process? Is it just simply down to the excess calorie burn from the cardio?
So you're talking about concurrent training where you're doing cardio along with. So
Yeah,
it, it would depend on the extent of the cardio you do. So if you're doing moderate cardio, I don't certainly want to kind of rein that in to some extent and say that there is the evidence that we have now is really suggesting that moderate cardio does not have negative much, if any,
okay,
negative effects on hypertrophy. But when you start doing a lot of cardio, if you're going to look to run a marathon, it certainly will. And if you're asking
yeah,
mechanistically, it's not completely clear, but there is several theories. Number one is that there is different intracellular signaling pathways that are catabolic pathways versus anabolic. There's something called the AMPK pathway, which is a inhibitor of the mTOR pathway, and there's evidence that you highly upregulate as you start getting into a lot of cardio,
okay.
the AMPK pathway. There's other evidence that certainly theoretically that muscle protein synthesis requires an energy surplus. And when you're expending
Hmm.
of energy in your cardio, that's going to take away the ability for the body to synthesize proteins to build muscle. So when it comes to mechanistic, people think that we have all this figured out mechanistically, but it's very difficult
Yeah,
to hone in mechanistically on what causes something because there's a lot
hmm,
of confounding variables. So a lot of times when we look for mechanisms, they're more speculative. That are, we get certain theories based upon what we know and logic, trying to get a logical extrapolation. But to give you an exact mechanism, it's very difficult.
yeah, it's hard to get. You mentioned, oh, sorry, you mentioned there anabolic catabolic pathways. So like anabolism is your body's ability to grow, and then catabolism is the breaking down of certain things. In order to be anabolic, you need to be in a caloric surplus. Um, I don't. So when we get down to muscle mass gains, a lot of times clients also want to, uh, let's say, recomp. So they
Yeah.
might want to lose weight as they build muscle mass. But should you just be focusing, if the goal is muscle gain, should you just be focusing on gaining that muscle mass? I could be talking about a guy, let's say 20, 25% body fat. Um, should he just focus on being in a slight surplus of 250, 300 calories per day and trying to make best use of his time in the gym, those three times a week? Or should he go down the road of trying to maybe drop some pounds as well? Or is that even possible to do both, seeing as one is anabolic and the other potentially catabolic?
Yeah. So I'll first address that you don't necessarily, well, the answer would be it depends. Okay, do you have to be in a surplus, caloric surplus, to be anabolic, or at least to build muscle? There's three
Mm-hmm.
primary factors that are going to enter into this equation. Number one, how much body fat do you have to lose? Number two, um, what is your previous training experience? And number three, and I least want to address this, but we can put it out of the equation given your case study, is if they're taking anabolic steroids or other
Mm-hmm.
pharmacological anabolic. So assuming that the person you're talking about is natural and not taking that out, we can
Yeah.
just deal with the two, that how much fat do they have to lose and what is their training experience. So within those two, the more fat you have to lose and the less well-trained you are, the easier it is to build muscle
Gain muscle.
while
Hmm.
losing body fat. I will say this, if you want to maximize muscle growth, you should be in somewhat of a caloric surplus. But to your question then, so with that as background, so if someone's goal is they want to recomp, you got to go with their goal is. If
Yeah.
they're a bodybuilder, so if they have bodybuilding goals, then that's kind of a different animal, because then you
Yeah.
have to look at maximizing muscle mass to its greatest extent, and that becomes a different discussion altogether. But from what you're talking about, I would say certainly someone 25% body fat can be gaining some muscle while losing
Hmm.
body fat if their goal is not to compete in the bodybuilding,
Yeah.
more to look good. And yeah, I would definitely say they could do that. Generally speaking, you want to lose weight somewhat slowly, so that you're half a kilogram per week, let's say, could be a general kind of upper range goal. If you're starting to lose more than that, if you're looking to lose weight rapidly, you're not going to be able again to gain muscle.
Yeah.
So that enters into the equation. But, and again, this is just theoretically, when you have a lot of body fat, the body can actually use your stored fat for energy, whereas you don't need to be taking in the
Okay.
calories. As you get closer and closer,
Hmm.
let's say you start getting into single digit body fat levels. So you're 10%, 9%, 8%. The
Yeah.
lower you start going, the less fat reserves you have for your body to use to support protein synthesis, to support its energy requirements. And thus, the harder and harder it becomes to continue to build muscle.
Okay. And then obviously you mentioned promoting protein synthesis. Uh, Protein intake is hugely important, and I think there's a little bit of confusion around how much protein is required. Um, so, in terms of protein requirements, what are your what's your recommended amount per kilogram of weight?
Yeah, so I think kind of a floor is around 1.6 grams per kilogram. I think that suffices for the vast majority of individuals. If you're a hard training bodybuilder, especially doing higher volumes, I think that rises. Or when I say I think it rises, I think we can make a case that it may rise to 2 grams per kilogram, 2.2. But with that said, when I say that's kind of all you need, 1.6, there's certainly no real detriment to taking in more. And I think, could there be a slight benefit? I can't rule that out even for your average individual. It's not like these are hard numbers that we have to get
Yeah.
that. Research is never going to give you an exact number. There's always going to be variations between individuals, genetics, lifestyle factors. So I would suggest for most people that they bump that up a little and look to consume probably 1.82 grams per kilogram per day. It's not going to hurt. Uh,
Yeah.
and
It's
like,
also very hard to eat too much protein
well,
because
correct.
it feels
And here's what I also will say, that just to that point, if you're looking to lose weight, that's for muscle building we're talking about. If you're looking to lose weight,
yeah.
it's an added benefit to higher protein intakes because they're very satiating. And thus,
Yeah.
you're going to consume higher protein intakes. They're going to blunt your appetite to some extent. And I'd also say to that end too, if you're in a caloric deficit, generally speaking, your protein requirements, at least the evidence we have, suggests that they might increase as
They
well. But
increase.
you might need to take in somewhat more protein if you're going to be looking to cut, lose more body fat
Yeah.
and be in a deficit.
And that's just to offset any potential breakdown of muscle.
Correct, because you're going to tend to be in a
Um,
metabolic state when you're in a deficit, and thus
okay.
it will conceivably it will buffer that.
And just if you could speak maybe briefly on the role of carbohydrates then and how they contribute towards muscle mass gains as well. I just find I know certainly for years now carbs have kind of excuse language been shit on, and people are almost afraid of consuming them. And actually, what they're doing is they're again impeding their ability to make the most of their situation and let's say maximize their potential for muscle growth because they're not eating enough carbs.
Yeah, so carbohydrates can be beneficial. So I mean, there's quite, I want to say compelling evidence, but we have a number of studies now showing that ketogenic diets are suboptimal for maximal muscle building. We can make certain speculations why, but certainly one of the things that we can look at is what drives the ability to perform a bodybuilding style workout, and that is glycogen levels. So glycogen is stored carbohydrate. It's muscles. Your muscles and your liver are the two depots for storing carbohydrate. And during exercise, during anaerobic exercise, where you're not able to use fat for fuel, very limited ability to use fat for fuel because it can't be utilized quickly, fat. So you have to use your stored glycogen for energy. And roughly, the literature shows roughly 80% of fuel during a bodybuilding style workout is supplied through glycogen. And after a moderately high volume workout, so 9 sets of an exercise, depletes almost half of your glycogen levels. So if you're conceivably, I mean, on a ketogenic diet, your glycogen levels are suboptimal and you're going to not be able to train as hard. And there's, again, evidence to this effect. So with that said, you don't need to necessarily eat high carbohydrate diet. Whereas if you're doing long distance running, so various longer and marathon type running, carbohydrates are much more important for you. And there's carb loading strategies that can benefit from that. But that's a separate topic. I would say for someone who's resistance training and just looking to build muscle, somewhere around, I think, again, always hesitate to throw minimum thresholds around because people want them, but a couple 100 grams of carbohydrates a day, probably minimum 150, 200 grams, kind of would be a minimum threshold, depending again upon your volume that you're carrying out and your frequency of training. But for the fairly minimalist routine that you're talking about, I think that certainly should suffice, somewhere around 150 to 200 grams per day of carbs.
Okay. And is there a role that dietary fat can play in the building of muscle mass?
Yeah. So when we talk about dietary fat, there's several different classifications of fat. You have your basic classifications of saturated versus unsaturated. There does not seem to be much evidence that saturated fats are beneficial, at least more beneficial than your unsaturated fats. And there's detriments potentially to health. Saturated fats have been shown to have negative implications for cardiovascular disease. And I generally, in my humble opinion, think that you should limit saturated fat intake pretty much as possible. And there's different types of saturated. This is way beyond the scope of what we could talk about, but it's important to also note that different saturated fats apparently have different atherogenic effects on the body. So certain stearic acid seems to be neutral to heart disease, and others seem to be more atherogenic. But from a muscle building standpoint, your unsaturated fats, you have your polyunsaturated fats and your monounsaturated fats. Your monounsaturated fats are like olive oil, avocado. They have, again, very beneficial health benefits. It's been shown. Its role in muscle building is less clear, but what seems to be more clear is that polyunsaturated fats, particularly your omega-3 fats, which are a class of polyunsaturated fats, seem to have muscle building properties. They seem to enhance cell signaling, intracellular signaling, so benefiting the body's ability to allow signals to get into the cells, particularly anabolic signaling. They keep the cells more fluid. So there's been several, again, speculations and as to why they seem beneficial. But I think we're getting some emerging evidence now that making sure you get sufficient omega fats. And I will say that the sources of these fats are fatty fish, so certain types of fish, including salmon, mackerel, tuna, and other cold water fishes seem to be they have greater beneficial properties, omega-3 properties. And there's also, if you're a vegan, it's in flaxseed oil has a high percentage of fat. So there's other sources, vegetable sources also you could get, krill.
Okay. And then I suppose to finish, because I think it's coming up to 10 to the hour now, on supplementation. So the most obvious one is just a protein powder, which we've already, well, it should be obvious based on what you've spoken about so far, in that, trying to hit a protein target, taking a protein powder can be of obvious benefit there.
I want to say that there's no benefit. I don't know if you were going on from there, but there is no benefit in itself to taking protein powder. Is nothing special. It's powdered protein. So yes, it's beneficial if you have difficulty getting insufficient protein.
Yes.
But you don't need, there is no evidence that it has an added benefit other than what.
Yeah, it's if you struggle to consume through food sources, whole foods, that's where you would require a protein supplement.
Correct.
And then the same thing could obviously be assumed then for essential amino acid supplementation.
Even less so. Okay. So if you're taking in whole proteins, there's no reasons to take EAAs. And certainly even less to take your BCAAs. So branched chain amino acids are 3 of your essential amino acids that have been targeted as like this special supplement. And then it's beneficial to take them if your protein intake is suboptimal. Then you can get some benefits from BCAAs, but you'll get even more benefit from just taking in whole proteins. So there's no benefit. I would never suggest taking a BCAA supplement.
And the last one then would be creatine and its impact on muscle building, given that it's it's one way of boosting your energy pathway for lifting. Does creatine, would you recommend the use of creatine to help build muscle mass?
Yeah, so creatine is the one muscle building supplement that has the most research behind it and the most efficacy that's been shown to build muscle. We actually just published a meta-analysis on this topic, looking specifically at hypertrophy measures. And yes, so creatine does, on a population level, show beneficial effects on hypertrophy. It is not steroid-like benefits, as some people. The effects are, fairly modest, but I should also go back, I think, to regress. Creatine is stored as a stored form of energy, again, being simplistic about it, in your muscles, and it can regenerate ATP. It helps to regenerate ATP production, which is what drives energy production to carry out work in the body. And when you start training, you will start to deplete your ATP levels, and creatine regenerates these ATP, which allows you to continue training. That in itself has been shown to help your strength levels and performance, and just conceivably, we talk mechanistically, improved performance should translate into greater benefits, muscle building benefits. There is also speculation, more than speculation, creatine also seems to drive water into the cell. So creatine serves as an osmolyte and does attract intracellular fluid. That does seem, there's evidence, not in vivo, not in the living humans, but like in test tubes and other types of similar research, that hydration, cellular hydration, is anabolic and anti-catabolic, which would again seem to drive the muscle building response. So there seems to be 2 mechanisms where creatine can work. And again, there's evidence that in longitudinal studies that creatine does promote greater hypertrophy. You do not necessarily need to load. So 3 to 5 grams per day is all generally you need. If you're going to load where you're taking, let's say, 5 grams 4 times a day, people do get some, there can be some issues,
digestive issues.
exactly,
Yeah.
gastrointestinal issues with that, but it just expedites the storage into the muscles. I will say that
Yeah.
people who are vegetarians seem to benefit more because creatine is heavily involved in meat and fish. So if you're a vegan in particular, you can gain more benefits. Those who eat a lot of meat and fish tend to not see as good benefits through creatine. There are, I think, a third, 30% or so are non-responders. So it's not like everyone gets the same benefit. What I would say is you can try it.
Yeah.
You get a benefit. Some people benefit, some people don't.
No, there's yeah, plenty of there's plenty in this talk for clients to truly benefit from. Now, I was going to, I had said in the email that depending on time, I was going to look at other topics, benefits of strength training for weight loss, benefits of weight training in women and or in older populations. But maybe we can come back to that another time and schedule something else.
Absolutely.
Just want to thank you for your time today, Brad. Really enjoyed that. It was very informative, and for sure, a few of the lads in the gym are going to enjoy that.